I have no idea whether that works or not.
Good morning. Welcome to our third annual October Best. We're glad that you all decided to come here and join us for a day of discussion and sharing about best practices and methods that we can use to make the learning experience more meaningful for our students. I have just a couple of quick announcements for you. First of all, if you're a TA, there's a blue form in your packet. You need to make sure to fill that out before you leave and make sure that it's on in the filing tray as you walk out the door. Don't leave if you're a TA without filling out that blue form. If you're a faculty, there's a white evaluation form that also needs, if you would, even if you leave after a couple sessions, if you can fill out that white evaluation form and leave it with Ruth on your way out, that really helps us maintain quality and address topics that are of interest to you. And finally, this is for everybody because all of us, I can tell by looking, are going to need this. When you come to the reception this afternoon, you need to bring your ID because you will be carded. And again, it's going to be obvious that we're going to have to check every single thing. If you would, for the reception, have an ID with you.
Faculty ID?
Yeah, sure. That's university policy, so we have to do that. We have two co-sponsors that we need to thank up front. During lunch and during the breaks, you'll see on the slides that there are a number of other people that have helped us out. But there are two in particular that have really worked with us to put this event on. The first is the Office of Information Technology. They have really been gracious with their time and expertise, and university libraries allowing us to use this facility. So we wanted to recognize them and their cooperation on this event. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to our keynote speaker for this morning, Bob Duke.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you. If you don't mind, I won't use the overhead mic. I have this on so because they're recording it, and so and you seem like it's loud enough in here without using that, right? I'd like to do something that I know is going to be annoying, but I'm going to get it out of the way right away. I just noticed as everyone's sitting down, you're sitting next to people. Most of you are sitting next to people who you know and you're having conversations with. I'd like you all to move and sit next to somebody who you've never spoken to before. Okay, would you do that now? That's all right. Are you, okay, perfect.
You're very concerned about this raffle. I don't really.
Yeah, I didn't know there was a raffle. No, go sit over with those guys. Go make a friend.
I love this table.
Okay, well, bring them over here then, but go sit next to somebody you don't know.
Sorry, are you going to sit in this one?
I love this table.
Now, first of all, thank you for being cooperative. I just want to point out how much we are our students, right? Because first of all, you know, we do sort of gravitate to people we know and already have a conversation with, and that's where we sit when we come to class, and that's what our students do too. Also, just like students, we create a demilitarized zone of between you and the professor, so there's a big open space here because you don't want to get too close because they might see you and things, and it's much better to be sort of back. Like I'm worried about those people back in that table over there. They look very suspicious. And one of the reasons that I do this initially, and I will just sort of interject this through the course of my talk this morning and a little bit this afternoon too, is there are a few things that can happen that are very low impact in terms of the amount of effort it takes on your part and the student's part, and this is one. Just having students not sit next to the same people every day. It changes the tenor of a class. It makes classes feel smaller, even when they're really big. And I'll just sort of interject little $3 tips like that as we go through. Next thing I'd like you to do is take out a piece of paper. I'd like you to write for a minute. Now, again, I think a lot of times, you know, when you go to a talk and I go to a talk, I don't expect to have to do anything. You know, I'm just supposed to sit and listen, and somebody else will be talking. So I'm going to ask you to do something. So if you get a piece of paper, and for the people who don't have pieces of paper, if someone with a piece of paper would help them out. They came unprepared to class. Yeah, thank you so much.
And we always yell at our students.
Yeah, exactly, right. And what I'd like you to do for the next 4 minutes is on your piece of paper, I'd like you to write what you consider to be the 3 most important, far-reaching, interesting ideas in your discipline. Right? The 3 most important, far-reaching, and interesting ideas in your discipline. And we'll just take 4 minutes to do this. And interesting, yeah. 3 most important, far-reaching, and interesting ideas in your discipline. You guys got it? Okay. And I hope what some of you are finding interesting is that 3 don't immediately come to mind. And so I hope you're asking yourself, why don't they? Right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. Take about 1 more minute to finish. And now what I'd like you to do is you look at what you've written on your paper. If you would pick the most interesting of those 3, and I'm going to ask you now to explain it to one person sitting next to you, okay? And as you're listening to your table mate explain this to you, your job as the listener is to ask 2 interesting, elaborating questions that helps clarify what your table mate is talking about, right? So one of you is going to explain one of these ideas to somebody sitting next to you. As you're listening, what you need to be thinking about is how you can ask 2 interesting questions that help your table mate elaborate and clarify what they're telling you, okay? So if you're sitting at a table with an odd number of people, would you find another odd person and talk to them? Because I think we have an almost good set of, yeah, that didn't come out right, did it? Okay, so what I would like you to do when you have this conversation is take 2 minutes to explain your idea, and then I'll give you a signal when it's time to switch, and then the other person will explain their idea. Okay, so would you start that now? Go ahead. So would one of you just explain it to one other person instead of 4?
We don't follow directions.
I understand that. That's exactly why I'm standing here.
It is.
And so, are you explaining to her?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So are you explaining to him?
Yeah, sure.
So would you go stand over here so you can talk to him? Yeah.
So that's sort of where a lot of the movement, especially learning becomes more important.
would you switch roles now, please, and the other person be the explainer and the other person the question asker?
We never got around to asking the question part.
So I guess the idea I might be the only one in my.
Being overweight may predispose you to heart disease.
And you have parts of the room all the sounds and all
Would you take about a half a minute?
how the focus of the classroom is really goes on and how they get excited about learning, just like we do. It does.
But that was one of the things that
But they do. They do. And even kids are very different. The teachers are very more active, but just not.
are you doing that on this basis yet, or that's
Yes, we are. We have a teacher that's been doing
Okay, would you find a way to bring your conversation to a close, please?
I have a few more questions, but maybe I'll talk
I
to you about
know.
it later. That's interesting.
But I found ways to speak less.
First of all, thank you for cooperating and talking to your classmates and everything. But now I want to point out a couple of things about what just happened. First of all, this should happen in class every day. The time when learning is taking place is when you're doing what you're doing right now. This isn't learning time. This is just me talking time, right? And I promise you all the time that you're sitting and listening to me talk, a little truth in advertising, none of you is going to learn anything. And the reason is because you're not busy enough to learn something. Right now, which is what often happens in classes, when classes aren't structured like this, I don't know what your classrooms look like generally around campus. I mean, it's a beautiful library and a beautiful space with tables that move and chairs that can turn around. Most learning environments are set up with the idea that what students need to be doing when they go into a classroom is listening to an expert talk about stuff, right? And so we bolt the chairs to the floor to make sure there's no error about that. Students sit at desks, you put stuff up on a PowerPoint slide, everybody writes a lot. Class goes on for, you ask for any questions, a couple students who like to be seen, ask a couple of questions, everybody leaves the room, and that's sort of the end of class. And actually what I'd like to suggest today, not just this morning, but this afternoon too, is what's required to actually engage somebody's thinking such that you affect their memory. Because basically what we're doing, we're trying to teach people anything, right, is we're trying to create memories that are persistent. And not only persistent, but advantageously retrievable and generalizable. And that doesn't happen through listening. What I hope many of you found the case when you're talking to your new friends while you're talking today, and often this happens when I give talks like this, is that in explaining the idea out loud, it changed the way you think about the idea a little bit. Especially if you were explaining it in a way you hadn't explained it before. And to a person you haven't explained it to before who's not already an expert in your discipline, right? So now you have to think of other ways to say things. And you have to consider, well, what does this person need to know to understand the big idea, right? Do I need to give some background stuff before I get to the main point? And now everything changes about the way you're thinking. And my overarching point that I'll tell you right now, and then you don't have to come, you can actually leave this morning because I'm just going to tell you this, and that's the point, is thinking about what is required in order to form or refine a memory in an organic brain. One little segment that I'll repeat now and this afternoon concerns the way we form memories for what happens to us, right? For a long time, up to the middle of the 20th century, the prevailing wisdom was brains work sort of like tape recorders, right? You woke up in the morning, record button goes on, you go through the day, stuff gets written on the tape, you go to sleep at night, stop button goes on, you wake up the next day, you want to remember 2 o'clock the day before, you rewind the tape to 2 o'clock, play the tape, there's 2 o'clock the day before. That's a terrible metaphor for organic brains. And now putting it in 21st century lingo, brains aren't flash drives, right? It's not stuff that you write memories on and then it's in there and then we go get it later. And in fact, when you think about that, what's different about organic brains and flash drives has to do with the way the memory is actually stored, right? When you're working at your computer and you hit the save command, what your computer does is actually looks for a blank space on the flash drive, writes whatever you've saved on it, puts an address on it, and on the drive itself, transistors flip from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1 in some configuration that represents the stuff you just saved, and barring some electrical or physical catastrophe, when you go back and you click on the icon that's attached to that address, it goes, finds the stuff on the flash drive, reads it off, and there's the memory. And it's just like it was when you wrote it there, right? Again, barring some catastrophe, right? Organic brains don't work anything like that. For several reasons. First of all, there are no blank spaces in your brain where new stuff goes, right? Your brain's all active a lot of the time. And when you form memories in an organic brain, unlike what happens on a flash drive, right? When you write something on a flash drive, the physical structure of the drive doesn't change, right? When you write something on a flash drive, the drive is structured the way it is, the memory goes on it. Like I said, the transistors change positions, but that's it, right? The switches change, the electrons move, that's basically it. When you write a memory in an organic brain, the actual physical structure of the brain has to change. So it's not like there's a brain with memories in it. The brain is the memories, right? So when you form a memory for some experience that you have as a learner, as a just person walking around living your life through the day, what has to happen is your brain actually has to make new proteins and create new stuff or prune away other stuff to actually create a memory. So the memory is the physical structure of your brain. Now the question you have to ask yourself, if you're a teacher or a parent or anyone you're trying to influence the behavior of some other human being, what's required that would motivate a brain to expend all the energy it actually takes to form a memory? And the answer is a lot more than sitting and listening, right? And if you think about it, the current wisdom in modern psychology is that the psychological present, what we think of as like now, is a window of about 3 seconds in duration. So 3 seconds is now, and then that 3 seconds is then, and there's a new now, and that happens throughout the day. And if you get a normal amount of sleep in a normal waking day of a typical adult, you experience 20,000 nows, most of which are completely forgotten, right? And good, right? There would be no advantage to my remembering the actual appearance of all the people who I passed when I walked into the library getting up to this room, right? That's trivial information. It's in no way advantageous to me, and I forget it. And so I have all these experiences that go on all day long that my brain just lets go away. Now the question you got to ask is, so what do you have to do to get a memory to stay? And not only to get it to stay, but to get it to be retrievable in an advantageous way and generalizable so I can actually use that information in some way to accomplish some goal at some point in the future. And that's what we're talking about today. I want to start by putting up a list of questions that are my least favorite questions to hear from undergraduate students. The bottom one's my least favorite. Yeah, we just goofed around. It's better you didn't come, actually. It was just kind of not a good day. Now, I want to tell you that those are adaptive human responses there. That's not a genetic predisposition you're looking at up there. It's advantageous to ask questions like that if you're a kid, right? But let me translate some of those questions into more precise language. So when somebody asks, Dr. Duke, how long does this paper need to be? The real question that's being asked is, Dr. Duke, how short could I possibly make this paper and still get the grade that I want, right? Or if somebody says, how many references do I need to have in this? How few things can I read? And so, right? Now, so what everybody's shooting for is how can I aim low, right? How can I find the minimum stuff that I need to do? Now, I want to suggest to you, those are adaptive because we teach people to ask questions like that, right? That's not natural human behavior we're seeing, right? They learn that in school. And it serves them well, particularly really good students, right? So the things I'm going to talk to you about today have to do with changing things in a way that will be initially unsettling for learners. Because all learners like to know very, very clearly how they're going to be evaluated, right? Tell me exactly what I'm going to do and what I need to do, and I will be sure I do that, especially the very best students in our classes, right? I mean, when I talk at different campuses around the country, the students who have the most difficulty with what I'm going to talk about today are pre-med students whose lives rise and fall with their points in a given class, right? To the point that it's way beyond anything that anybody would describe as, boy, that's a healthy way to think about it, right? So now you got to ask the question, how do you break out of that? And many people say, well, you just can't, you got to go with it. Well, I disagree. There is a way to break out of it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is my favorite phrase that I ever made up, and it makes me happy because it has such a big reach. That every thought about teaching somebody something should begin with that, with a vision of students as accomplished learners. And what I mean by that is, before I start planning a class, or teaching a class, or imagining what needs to be in my degree program, I'm thinking about what is the ideal learner going to be like at the end. Now, one of the things I emphasize about this is I'm saying what are they going to be like, not what are they going to know and be able to do, right? Which is the lingo of curriculum, right? Because all of you who are experts in here are experts not only because of what you know, and not only because of what you can do with what you know, but you have an attitude about your subject matter that allows you to function effectively in a discipline. If you're aspiring to be a bench scientist, and every time an experiment doesn't work, you want to start throwing equipment across the room, you're not going to be a very effective bench scientist. You're not going to be a bench scientist very long, because everybody who knows here who's a bench scientist, most experiments don't work, right? And so there's not only a matter of knowing stuff to being a bench scientist, you have to have an approach to the work that you do day in and day out that allows you to function successfly and happily in the stuff that you're doing. So I wrote down a list of adjectives for you nice compulsive note takers. Don't write these down. Of my favorite student, right? I would love to have rooms full of this kid, right? But I reject out of hand the notion that babies come from the factory like that, right? I mean, people learn to be attentive, or they don't, and people learn to be meticulous about their work, or they don't. And all of you know that if you followed any one of your students around through their course schedule through the course of a week, you will know that all of your students will demonstrate different levels of all those variables depending on whose room they're in, right? They will go into some classes having done the reading before the lecture. Amazing, right? And other people, what is this in the semester, like week 6 or something? Be thinking, well, I probably should get the book, test is coming up, right? Now the thing is, it's the same kid, right? So why is it that one kid wants to sit in the front of the room and make sure they've got all their stuff together and they've already thought of questions that they bring to class, and that same kid goes to another class and they've got the daily gamecock out to the crossword puzzle, right? It's the same kid. So you have to think there are things that are going on in the room that are making it more or less likely that the person's going to be into what they're doing or not. And that has a lot to do with the way we structure what goes on in the room. Right? And one of the things about this that to me is always interesting is how little change it takes to start to get the students to think differently about what their role is. I mean, I was very gratified as I'm sort of walking around eavesdropping while people were talking in your little pairs today, how many people said, because I didn't give you enough time, to say, well, let's talk about this after the thing. Now, just think about that for a minute. You're talking to somebody you've never known before, right? About a subject matter that you may not know a lot about, and somebody told you something about it, and you want to talk to that person more. Now, I mean, not to gloat, but I did that, right? I mean, this experience did that. Because if you're sitting next to somebody you talk to every day, and your teacher says, talk to the person sitting next to you about whatever, well, forget it. Like, where are we going to lunch? And did you get your car fixed? And I got an iPhone 5. You want to see that? I mean, right? I mean, that's where you are, right? So that changes when you're sitting next to people that you don't know initially, right? So this isn't a first day thing. This is an everyday thing. The other thing is, I gave you less time than you needed to do what I asked you to do. And I say this, and keep smiling all the way through this, because I know if I gave you more time, a lot of you would be off task after about 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm not going to give you 5 minutes to talk to each other, because I think most of you couldn't go for 5 minutes staying on task. And I don't mean that to insult you. I mean that to say we're human beings, and we're in a room together with somebody we don't know. And I see you're from languages, and I have a friend in languages, and so now we're off task, right? So I gave you less time to do what I asked you to do, and the task I asked you to do was pretty highly structured. Now, if I start doing this at the beginning of the semester, and we cultivate that as a habit of what's going on in class, as the semester goes on, I can give you more and more time to talk with people and less specifics about what I want the outcome of that conversation to be. And then a conversation begins to be working on its own without my having to structure everything. And my hope is, and it's not just an idle hope, I mean, it actually sets up this way, is that now students walk out of the classroom and they're still talking about stuff that we did in the class, and I'm not even prompting anymore, right? Now, I know that most of us went to school and had experiences in school where that isn't what teachers did with us. We did sit in rooms with chairs bolted to the floor and took notes and took exams and wrote papers and went to labs and those kind of things. So how'd we turn out so great? Because no one did that for us. Well, the thing is, I think for most of us in this room, first of all, we liked school. For most of us, I mean, we like school so much we're still in school, right? I couldn't believe what a revelation it was to me when I realized if I stayed in graduate school long enough, they would start paying me. And now here I am, how many years later. But in addition to that, we were oddly curious. So we'd go to a lecture and somebody would talk about some interesting idea or something that we didn't understand, and then we would leave and actually talk to a classmate about, well, did you understand that thing? And maybe even open the book and try to figure out what the consistency or inconsistency was between what we just heard and what was here, and we did that. Now, we could all say, well, students should do that. Well, they should, but they don't. But they should. Yes, but they don't. But they should. But they don't. So you can say, well, they should, and then be annoyed, or you can actually create experiences in class where you structure that experience for the students, right? Where that now becomes the routine. You're going to come into class and you're going to explain something to somebody, right? Or you're going to work on some specific goal that requires somebody else's input to actually get whatever it is you're trying to get done. So let's talk just a little bit about making that happen. When I first went to Texas in 1985, you can tell from my accent I'm not from Texas. If you'd told me, 28 years ago that I would spend the next 27 years in Texas, I'd say you're out of your mind. But, the place grows on you. It's a very, and Austin's a lovely town, it's lovely. But when I first went there, I didn't know anybody. I'd never been to Texas before except to, blow through on I-10. And so I got on this state committee that was put together to develop the first statewide teacher evaluation system for primary and secondary school children in the state of Texas. And I went to the first meeting, and it was some ridiculous committee. I got 30 people on it. I knew we're not going to get much done. So anyway, we're having this meeting, and the chair is kind of telling us what our charge is and going through the things. And after about 30 minutes of different people talking, I said, there are about 18 states who have already done this and are actually either piloting or actually using things like that. Why don't we go get their documents and use that as a starting place, forgetting where I just moved. There's a long pause after I suggested that, and the chairman looked at me and said, "Other states," and everybody started laughing. Well, why don't we look at other states? We're Texas. We're going to start. So anyway, I prevailed upon them to let me go and look at the other states' things. So I collected all of that stuff, and I put them all together. And I wanted to see, well, what were the common variables that existed through all those 18 or 19, however many it were, teacher evaluation systems, and that's what was on them, right? Those 6 things. Now, the language might have varied from one to another, or they might have been, organized in a different order, but basically, when teaching gets evaluated, that's the stuff that gets evaluated, okay? Now, I have a question to you. Of those 6 things that are up there, which of those things do you think gets the least attention when teachers are evaluated? What do you think gets the least attention? Pardon me? Learning environment? Huh? Feedback. Yeah. Yeah, right. So I have probably at least one advocate for every bullet, right? So you know what gets the least attention? The first one. You got a degree in physics? Okay, good. Let's go look at your learning environment. Now I got to tell you a little truth in advertising, right? It's possible to go through an undergraduate degree and make very good grades in all your classes and pass everything and walk across the stage at the end and have the dean hand you a degree in a little nice folder and move your tassel and not really understand your discipline very deeply, right? So the reason I was asking you at the beginning today, what are the most interesting, far-reaching, important ideas in your discipline, is that all of you understand, I mean, if you give it sufficient time to think, that all of the discipline is organized around those very basic ideas. And there are people who are working, teaching a class, whatever it happens to be, at whatever level, and those basic underlying principles are not in the room. They're certainly not in the minds of the students who are learning. And all of you know, regardless of your discipline, all of our disciplines are organized around a very small number of very fundamental ideas, right? And when a student hears me give a talk, and I seldom use notes anymore, I've been doing this for so long, and they say, Dr. Duke, how do you remember all that? I couldn't possibly remember all that. And I respond to them by saying, you know what, you're right, you couldn't possibly remember all that, but it has nothing to do with the limitations of your memory store, right? The reason I can remember all this stuff and seemingly pull stuff out of the air and remember individual experiments and different citations is not because my memory is better than yours. It's because my memory is organized differently than yours is, right? Now, the way we sort of set up forming memories for learners is, again, in a way that is contrary to the way we know organic brains form memories, and that is, I'm going to put a bunch of memories in your head, and then later on, I'm going to ask you to pull them out, and we're going to use them, right? And unfortunately, because of the way we know brains form memories, a lot of that stuff is no longer accessible because we haven't engaged with it in an active enough way while we're actually doing the learning. And the best, worst example of this is medical schools. Now, you would think, of all places, medical schools would know how organic brains work, and they do, but there's no transfer of that knowledge to setting up instruction, right? Because over the past 5 years, I'm on the medical school circuit now. I got to give a lot of talks to medical school faculty. And what's interesting to me is the idea, and those of you who have friends who have been to med school, if you've been to med school, you know that, when it's virology week, you read your virology book, and the virologist on the faculty comes in and gives the virology lectures, and everybody sits and writes a lot for 5 days with the idea, we're going to put all this in your memory. Then when you take your boards, you're going to answer your virology questions. That's all going to be in your head. And then when you're doing your residency and you're on rounds and a patient presents with a certain combination of symptoms, you can go back in your virology memory, pull out all that stuff, and then make some diagnostic thing about the patient. Memories don't work like that, right? Brains don't work like that. And much of what determines the retrievability of a memory in the future is how the memory is encoded in the first place. So the notion that we're going to store all those memories and then we'll go start using them later is grossly mistaken. And when you want to make memories retrievable, which of course all of us want to do when we're teaching students and trying to get them to be effective in some discipline, they need to practice actually using the information while they're gathering the information. And not the idea we're going to put it in and then we'll go get it out later. And the thing that's kind of interesting about that when you look at a lot of young learners is that if you're a good speaker and a good lecturer and you can explain things clearly, right? Everybody's following along, everybody understands what you're saying, and they walk out of the room and say, did you understand that? Yes, I understand it perfectly because I followed along everything that person said. Well, now, would you explain that to this person? And quickly you find out, well, wait a minute, what was that middle thing again? Because I don't remember that thing. And now what's revealed to you is, I don't really understand this like I thought I did. And most of our thresholds, and certainly our students' thresholds, for understanding something are way too low. Because for them, understanding is, I can understand it when you explain it to me. But that's a very low threshold of understanding, right? What understanding really requires is, can I use this information in some meaningful way to accomplish some goal? So the task then becomes, how can I set up goals throughout every class period where students are actually using the information to accomplish something meaningful? And that's what we'll get to in a second. Okay, so what I mean by knowledge of subject matter is not just, having a degree in it, right? I mean, first, understanding your discipline from outside your expertise. I mean, all of us in this class have taken a course somewhere in our undergraduate degree program called fill in the blank for non-majors, right? And left the class thinking, what was that for? Why did somebody make me take this? I don't know what your own educational experiences were. My probably worst experience of a year of a wasted hour every day in my life was 7th grade geography. Just horrible. I had this lovely man, charming, lanky, this gentle Southern accent, just the worst thing in the world. Had this big, thick book, had geography like in 100-point font across the top, And I used to look at this book and say, how could anybody write a book about this? This is just so horrible. So anyway, so I made it through that class, got over that. I wanted to forget that as much as I could. And I went to college as a freshman, and I was at some sort of, freshman mixer, meet people from other colleges and everything. We're sitting around, I'm drinking punch with this guy in the gym or something, and we all got name tags on like you guys do. And I looked down at the guy's name tag, and it's got our majors on it, and I see the guy's a geography major. And I thought to myself, good God, who so misadvised you into this, there's nothing interesting about this. I think it's a drop-ed period. Maybe it's not too late, you can find another major, Now I'm talking to this guy, and he's starting to tell me about why he's a geography major. I didn't know about any of the stuff he was telling me about. Because what I learned in Mr. Norcross's class in 7th grade, well, the principal exports of Chile and the altitude of Mount Everest and how many cattle there are in the cattle farms of Florida, because that's how my geography knowledge was going to be assessed, right? And the stuff that he was telling me didn't have anything to do with that. Now my sweet mother, who also lives in Austin, who's 87 years old, lovely woman, and ever since I was a child, has bought me an annual subscription to the National Geographic magazine, which she still does. Little card comes in the mail, and I read it as an adult for entirely different reasons than I read it when I was a teenage boy. But yeah, you guys too. So at that time, right, about, 10 years ago or so, there was an entire issue of National Geographic on cartography, which you probably know is the science of map making. Now, it never occurred to me that map making was a set of problems to be solved, right? How do you project a spherical surface on a flat plane and not screw stuff up, right? And you've seen different versions of that, right? You see maps that look like somebody took an orange peel and kind of squashed it so there are big gaps as you get toward the poles, right? And sometimes behind newscasters. We've all seen maps in front of our junior high classroom where you pull down the map and there are all the longitude lines are parallel all the way from the floor to the ceiling. So Greenland looks like it's 4 times the size of South America. Of North America, and Antarctica is gigantic. Now, why would somebody make a map like that? Why would you do that? And think about how many times we've looked at that map and thought, yeah, map, and the fact that it's distorted the farther you get from the equator. Why would somebody do that? Well, that map is actually called a Mercator projection, after the explorer Mercator. And the reason they would make a map like that is because if you put a straight edge on that map between 2 points, you can set compass directions by that, no matter where you are on the map. Even though you know that the farther away you get from the equator, the more distorted the sizes of the land masses and bodies of water become. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing about why somebody would do that and how that map would be useful. But no one told us that. They just said, go find Greenland. And we walk up to the front of the room, we point at Greenland. Okay, sit down, next, right? Now, the thing you got to ask yourself is, how could I possibly think about what somebody who doesn't already know what I know find interesting about the subject matter at this point in their understanding? Rather than thinking about, I'll get to the interesting stuff after the midterm, right? Or in the second course, right? So different thing. Many of us experience this all the time, right? Because some people who are my contemporaries in age in this room, I see there are a few of you, remember when we were introduced to desktop computing for the first time, and how that was the coolest thing that ever happened, there's a computer like on your desk, and you all remember that the manuals written for those computers were written by evil people, right? Because they omitted critical pieces of information that you needed to get the thing to light up, You get your new computer, it's on your desk, it's in the box, you open up the box, you open the manual, it says, step 1, boot the system. It's in the box, what do you mean? Now, what well-meaning human being would write as step 1, boot the system? Because of course, the keyboard gets plugged in there in the CPU. And of course, the monitor has its own coordinate estimate. And of course, the floppy disk, remember floppy disks, they really were floppy. And of course, the floppy disk needs to be in that drive. And of course, the notch goes on the right. And of course, that lever goes there, unless you don't know any of that, right? Now, if you look at something like that and you watch somebody fumbling around, you think, boy, they're not really very good with computers, are they? Well, of course, because you told them to boot the system, right? And they have all this other stuff that they're supposed to know that they don't know before you ever get to the system booting part, right? For those of you who have children who have reached driving age and made the mistake of trying to teach them yourself, you know what a harrowing experience that is. Our daughter Janine, the first time I got in the car with her, I was just dumbstruck by her incompetence. She's sitting in the driver's seat. I'm sitting there, I said, go ahead, honey, start it up. With the key, to turn the key. Other way. Let go. Okay, let go. Now, the thing is, you got to just take that for a minute, right? So when you start your car, if you still have a car that has a key that you turn, I know some of you don't, how do you know when to let go of the key? Well, see, most of you are thinking, well, when it's time. Well, yeah, that's not very helpful if you don't know, right? So if you really ask yourself, what is the cue to let go of the key? Is it a sound? Is it just the passage of time? Do you feel a vibration in the seat? I mean, how do you know when it's time to let go of the key? And of course, for most of us, we're thinking, I don't think about that anymore. Exactly. And it may be that some of those things we don't think about anymore because they've become such a habituated part of our thinking, they're now well below our conscious awareness, are essential to understanding the stuff that we're trying to teach a novice learner, right? Just to think about that for a second. So I'm back to the interesting thing, right? Is that all of our disciplines are organized around a very small number of ideas that are intellectually interesting, and that's kind of speaks for itself, and functionally valuable. And what I mean by functionally valuable is information that you can actually use to do something else with, right? So knowing the number of cattle there are in cattle farms in Florida, that's not a functionally valuable piece of information, except to annoy your friends at parties with the trivia that you know. And the altitude of Mount Everest, I guess that's interesting, but only relative to other things that might make that fact interesting. But to know just that is to know not much of anything that would be useful in the future. So when you look at that list again of the things that people get evaluated by when they evaluate teaching, it looks like there are 6 things up there, but there are really only 4, because the 3 that are still lit up with the green arrow, that's actually all one thing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Those small number of central ideas in the discipline that are intellectually interesting and functionally valuable, those should be the instructional goals. And those goals should be the focus of what you do in class every day. And none of those goals are meaningful unless you define what students are going to do to demonstrate that they've mastered the goals, and that has to do with defining the assessment. So all of this focuses on the assessment. I mean, none of what we do in higher education or even in primary and secondary education is going to change in a meaningful way unless we change the way we evaluate what students have learned. Because if we evaluate by asking people the altitude of Mount Everest, they're going to think that's what the subject matter is about. But that's not what the subject matter is about. There are really interesting things to know about that, but I'm not going to ask you that because this stuff is much clearer and it's much more unambiguous when I grade you. Right? And the challenge of this, right, is again, because all of us like to be, when we're evaluated, to know exactly what's going to be asked of us and exactly what we're supposed to do, it's difficult then to break out of the idea that, well, I'm going to ask you some things that I've not shown you explicitly how to do, and I'm going to evaluate you based on how effectively you can use the information that you've learned in this class to solve that problem, or answer that question, or complete that task. Now, you can't just start doing that without freaking everybody out, right? But it's possible to do that in such a way that students have many opportunities to try and be confused and fail and then try some more in a way that advantages them because their brain is working in a way it's not working when they're just repeating stuff that you've shown them how to do. Now, is this a challenging goal for a teacher? It's a way more challenging goal. What's much easier to do if you're busy, read your lecture notes, show your PowerPoint slides, give them a test, you're done. And most people aren't going to complain, really. As long as you're a happy person and students know what to expect and they get reasonable grades, no one's going to complain about you. And your course evaluations will be just fine. But if your goal is deeper, this is my bias a little bit, if your goal is deeper and you say, you know what I'm trying to do is change the way you think. I can only do that if I actually try to find out how you think, right? And the reason I ask you to write at the beginning of class, every one of my classes I ask students to write at the beginning. It takes 3 or 4 minutes. I don't grade what they write, but I read what they write every day. So even if I have a class of 150 students, I have everybody write and I read what they write. But they're only writing like this much. So it takes me 10 to 15 minutes to flip through that because I don't need to read every word of everything. I'm not going to grade them, but it gives me a sense of what's going on in class. And as I have students talk to each other, especially if I'm in a room like this where I can actually walk in between all the tables, I can eavesdrop and find out what's going on in people's heads, which now puts me in a better place to be more effective when I'm actually trying to get something across to a new learner. Now, is this hard to do? Really hard to do. It takes practice. And Because it takes practice, when you start doing this, if you decide to start doing this, if you're not already doing it, you will be uncomfortable. And one of my things I will promise you is that nobody learns anything unless you're at least a little bit uncomfortable. So one of the things I say, I get to talk to freshmen a lot at Texas, and one of the things I say to a lot of freshman groups when I talk to them is that, you know you're learning because you're a little uncomfortable, and this is kind of unsettling, and I'm a little unsure what I'm supposed to be doing. So I wish all of them an uncomfortable career at the University of Texas. Because if you're in a class and you're just sitting there and you're writing down stuff, say, yeah, I understand that. Okay, I'll memorize this later. Okay, you're wasting your tuition. Right? Go into a place where your brain has to actually put forth effort to do something in class every day. And it will change the way you think. And most students are not going to initiate that on their own. Some will. In some classes, a number of them will. But for all those who don't, right, we can create that for them. And it doesn't only do a good thing. Like I said, this isn't just about the weak students in the class. This is about the very brightest students in the class. Because, again, the hardest students making the transition to this are the students who have mastered school and who understand school as, I'm in your class, I'm going to look at your syllabus, I'm going to figure out what you want me to learn, and I'm going to learn all that stuff, and I'm going to do what you tell me, and I'm going to get an A. And when you start to take that away, and you say, well, I'm going to ask you to do some things that I haven't actually shown you how to do. And they, how are you going to do that? Well, I'm not going to evaluate you in the same way. I'm not looking for you giving me a particular answer, because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for how you think, right? So it's not like you get an A if you get this answer and you get a B if you get that answer and you get partial credit. That's all gone now. And I'll talk at noon how to make all that happen. I don't think I want to show this film now because it's too long, so I'm going to let this go. And I'm going to end with one of my favorite thinkers, Alfred North Whitehead, who many of you know that name, one of the great mathematicians of the late 19th and early 20th century, wrote with Bertrand Russell, probably the most important piece of mathematical thought since Newton. They actually named their Principia after Newton's piece. And Whitehead had a very lovely way of describing the process of learning. There's a little thin little collection of essays that were actually a collection of public speeches that's published by Whitehead called The Aims of Education. It's a quick read, it's cheap, you ought to look at it. But one of the essays is called The Rhythm of Education, and obviously not talking about musical rhythm, but just the ebb and flow of how learning happens. And as Whitehead described it, the first stage of learning is what he called romance. And when you're attracted to something for the first time, you think, boy, I'd love to be a pre-med major because I want to be a doctor, and it's romantic, right? And what I mean by romantic is, this is my definition and not Whitehead's, but it comports with what he says, unrealistically highly positive, right? I mean, that has to do with romance and personal relationships too, right? You're at a party, you see someone across the room who's just lovely, and you just kind of watch her a little bit. She's just delightful, and you kind of get up your courage and you walk over there and introduce yourself, and she has a voice that's just and it's this thing she does with her hair, and she's really funny, and it's just delightful, unrealistically highly positive. Because at that moment, it doesn't occur to me this person eats, and they have bodily functions, and they get sick, and right? I mean, it's completely just unrealistic, right? And then life is a coming back to reality as you start to meet somebody, know somebody. Same thing with learning something, right? So as you go through this, after this stage of romance, if time is going up the y-axis here, this welcoming open pipe, starts to narrow, and you get to a stage that Whitehead calls precision. And this is where everybody changes their major. There, right? Or this is where you quit studying piano, or whatever it happens to be. Because I didn't know it was going to be like, no, I'm out of here, right? But if you're able to punch through that little narrow channel, you get to what Whitehead calls generalization, which is kind of romantic again, because you can actually do a little bit of the thing that attracted you to the thing in the first place, all right? Now, I have a little visual gimmick here, because I paid $30 for the software, so I got it. So this is what most students see using Whitehead's model here. This is what most students see when they go to school. You know what I mean? Oh, I'd love to do that. Oh, well, we're gonna torture you for a few years, and way out there in the distance, something lovely might happen, but it's going to be a long time from now, right? Now, the problem with that is that when we're planning something, right, we often imagine that you've got to have a lot more preparatory stuff in place before you can get to the interesting stuff about the discipline. And what I'd like you to think about today, especially those of you who are coming back at noon, is how it's possible to avoid doing that and how to get to what's interesting about the discipline early, I mean immediately. And that's on the table in every class. That doesn't mean there isn't stuff that you do have to just kind of buckle down and do the work. There is some stuff you have to memorize. There are some things you have to just practice doing that are kind of a little bit drudgery. But if that's all you're doing, because we're getting you ready for something that's going to happen like way off in the future, it's understandable that many students find what they're learning unmotivating, right? Now, I could go on for a very long time about this, you can tell, but I can't, not today. And I know you have other sessions to go to at 10 o'clock. And for those of you who will be around at noon, I'll see you guys at noon. And Jeremy, thank you for having me. And thank you all for listening. Thanks so much.
Okay, so our next session begins at 10. The rooms are, there's one over here, two over here, correct? And then this is the program room, so if you see that.